Okay, thank you for joining. Today is our webinar on ransomware attacks and how to stop adversaries in their tracks. I'm joined today by Alan Mitchell, who is a senior service provider solutions at Commvault, and myself, who is Stephen Crowe. I'm the general manager of security at ANS. And so the main discussion point for this will obviously be to talk around ransomware. I'm going to cover off how this usually gets onto a customer solution across your estate, onto endpoints, and what you can do to identify each stage of that attack chain that an attacker will take and how you can break that chain. And then Alan's going to do a deeper dive into how Commvault can assist with that protection layer and how to stop ransomware. So we just thought we'd start with some stats around ransomware and how much it impacts people. It's obviously a very important topic for everybody, and it's on the rise constantly. There's from the stats there you can see. So 65% ransomware coming from phishing, the majority of them against Windows. The stats there for how often that happens in 2021 obviously only going to keep going up as those attacks increase and the different types of ransomware increase as well. The cost of it is obviously devastating when you're looking at whether it's your data's been cryptolocked and you're trying to get the keys back and being ransomed for a lot of money. There's obviously a good average number there, and it's very expensive. And the majority of organisations, or up to half and probably even more, don't believe they're ready to defend themselves from ransomware and ensure their estate protected. So I'm going to start off.
A couple of points there, Stephen. Sorry for you move on. Just to kind of set the scene a little bit more, I think we're all painfully aware that ransomware is a growing threat, and it's almost unavoidable now. The 65% of infections through phishing. Now, phishing is obviously becoming more sophisticated in how attackers will approach your organisations. I don't think we're seeing any more of the Nigerian prince has got $100 million to offer you if you just send him some money. It's becoming more like someone from senior management within your organisation leads a response very quickly. So the language is changing, the attack vectors are changing. Going back to the beginning of the pandemic, we saw a lot of phishing attacks using Zoom or Teams invites. Well, that was to draw people in. So that it's certainly a changing market. On the Windows side, I mean, Linux platforms are by no means immune to attacks. That they're still in there, but a high percentage is obviously around the Windows install base. And recommendations there are keep them patched, keep them up to date. Unfortunately, attackers are aware of this already, so they'll start to package some threats that look like updates and push them out as well. So it's a difficult space to be in. On the cost of attacks, now this varies across geographies, but it's not just the cost of paying a ransom if you choose to pay it. There's also the cost of actually recovering the data, because paying a ransom doesn't necessarily get the data back for you. You still have to pull that back from somewhere, and that takes time and money and effort. There was a case in the US that got hit with a ransomware demand for $300,000. They chose not to pay it, I think rightly so, but ended up paying over $1 million in the recovery process. So at the same time, half professionals, IT professionals, don't think they're in a place to defend ransomware attacks. In a recent survey of organisations that were hit by ransomware and paid out, most of them said they would pay again. Conversely, of organisations that were surveyed that hadn't been hit by an attack, 67% said they wouldn't pay. So there's a bit of a gap here between what organisations think they can do and what they can actually achieve. So that's changing. Just again, kind of rounding off on that 20 billion number, this is a growing, attractive market that's attracting competition. It's becoming very innovative in how these attacks happen. We're seeing ransomware as a service on the rise. We're seeing double extortion tactics being used. So it's a growing market. It's not going away. As long as people pay ransom, there's going to be more and more demand for these types of attacks, and this industry's is going to blossom, unfortunately, over the next couple of years. So hopefully in the next couple of slides, we'll look at how we can help you mitigate those risks and put you in a much better position to survive if and when those threats happen.
Brilliant, thanks, Sam. So this might be something people are aware of, which I'm going to jump into in some more detail. And these are the stages that a typical adversary will take to get onto your network and then be able to deliver that sort of ransomware payload. And by understanding each of these points and then what you can do at each stage to block an attacker can really prevent the chances of you having some ransomware delivered and then having to pay those fines to get your data back. So it's called the cyber kill chain, and it's broken down into 8 steps. And what you can do is if we look at those individually, you can then understand what each of those stages mean, and then how you can go on to protect your organization. We'll give some examples for each of those stages about what you can do and what that actually looks like in the real world. So the first stage is reconnaissance, which is the sort of observation that an attacker will do, and that will be looking at your organization from an external point, something called OSINT, or open source intelligence gathering. And that can go from looking at individuals in your organization from their social media to try and gain access to, if they've had other devices compromised, and get passwords from those compromised sites by using, various resources on the internet, or even just looking at anything that's public facing of your infrastructure. So, if you've got external IP addresses, is there any vulnerabilities running on those? If you're running an admin panel that you use to update your systems, or to control what's on your website, if that's public facing, then somebody will be able to find that. So from that first stage of reconnaissance, once they've gained that information, the next thing an attacker will do is move on to looking at the intrusion stage. So this is usually an attack based on the information that they've gathered on the reconnaissance, whether that's against an individual user and their credentials, or whether it's against detecting a vulnerability and working at exploiting that vulnerability on your site, or through a brute force attempt. Which I was onto the third step of the chain, which is exploitation. So you're basically inside the door there. You've exploited the system. And from that stage onward, this is where an attacker will be able to learn more about your internal systems that they've compromised, install additional tool sets to allow them to, modify security certificates, create new scripts for whatever purpose they'd like, leading on to the point 4. So whatever level of access an adversary has got into your infrastructure, their goal will be to escalate it up to that of an administrator. Because with administrative privileges is where you can then bypass any sort of security tools that may be on the system, and they can then leverage administrative levels of privilege to change users, create new users, open ports, etc. Which then allows them to move on to step 5. So lateral movement is where, if you've had compromised infrastructure that may be connected to other elements or connected to other systems, that may actually be where your crown jewels of data sit, is where that attacker will look to move. That can be across a network, like I said, or to gain access to like a database, for example. Step 6 of the chain is when an attacker will go for obfuscation. Can I say that word properly? But that's where they'll try and not make it obvious what their purpose is, which is obviously deleting security logs or creating fake trails of data where they might be alluding to conducting some malicious activity in one place but not actually doing it. And the purpose of this is to hide their activity and not allow anyone to understand what they're doing. Denial of service is the next stage that they'll go through. So if you have those administrative purposes, the adversary could remove the ability for you as a genuine user to access your own systems by removing those accounts. Closing down network ports to you that are legitimate, shuts down firewalls, and this is where you get a lot of damage. And obviously, the last stage of the kill chain is exfiltration, or in this regard, I mean, it's covered as well. But exfiltration, where they're taking the data out, or they're doing something to that data, like putting ransomware around that data, so it becomes encrypted and you become a victim. So from an event perspective, what we see from looking at this from a managed security point of view, these are the type of events that we look out for along that kill chain, which allows us to then prevent them at each of those stages. So these usually start when we're looking at the first step of reconnaissance is through abnormal DNS lookup requests. Now, any of if you've got security knowledge tools, these will tell you that these are going on, and especially as well if your infrastructure is getting hits from IP addresses. If you subscribe to threat intelligence, then they'll say this malicious IP is doing lookups on your site. Then looking over to intrusion, the type of events we start to see is, all right, we start to see a lot of brute force attacks or logins against a platform from a genuine user with multiple failed passwords. That will then help you to understand, all right, okay, this at this point in time that an attacker is trying to target that user. So we need to do something at that stage. And on the next slide, I'll go on to what we can do in terms of a technology point of view there. Failed privilege escalations, it's obviously quite obvious that if you see after that brute force attack, an attacker has gained access to your system and they start to try and escalate their account or log on, say this user is trying to elevate their privileges to that of this user or this administrator, then that's how we detect them. Unusual activity between network devices. So this is again coming back to the lateral point. From a security operations point of view, what we'll see is a device that's not usually this noisy on the network, trying to access other devices over a number of ports that it never has used before, which is obviously a big concern and where we see the lateral movement coming in. Then obviously moving on to where we go for obfuscation is where the integrity of files are changed. So really from your point of view and a client's point of view, there needs to be some form of integrity check on your files, especially security logs and audit logs to show that they're not being deleted. And then it's coming back to exfiltration, which can be covered by encrypted and data being sent out the network. This is where if you have devices that are sending out large amounts of data, it could be you get not logs from your file to see that something's been sent over X amount of gigabytes that you're not used to is where you'll see this. But also if you it might be through like Exchange servers as well. So these are the steps that we take at each of those of the steps that kill chain to make sure that we have that level of protection at each of those stages. Because this allows us to try and break that chain at every single point and orchestrate a defense in depth methodology. So these are the areas for each of them there, the sort of kill chain steps that we would advise, and this is where we could assist and provide guidance around what needs to be done to break that chain. So when we look at the first, obviously reconnaissance is network hardening, is to ensure that you have the minimal amount of any of your infrastructure publicly facing. If you have to have any of those elements, is to put it through such like a platform that will be able to protect that external IP and not allow adversaries to see what that address is and therefore any vulnerabilities that are present on it. When we look at intrusion, what we would like to deploy is some extended detection response tooling, which allow intrusion prevention to happen. That's the best angle that you could do at that point of view, is to make sure that if there are any external attacks coming in, that they're being identified and blocked immediately. To ensure that your devices are secure, and if there are adversaries that gain access to devices, to make sure that you're securing your devices to an industry level baseline. That will allow your configurations to not allow some escalations of privileges to happen. And that also extends out into lateral movement. You should ensure that if your architecture is architected in such a way that only allows movement from one device to another over set ports that don't allow that sort of remote access or remote code execution. Then we're looking at secure orchestration or automated response when we're looking to like obfuscation or anti-forensics, which is to ensure that if there are actions being taken by a user on that system to say, if there's an adversary saying I'm going to delete all these files and folders, or I'm going to try and make changes to this user, that will kick off an automated response, which will maybe quarantine that device, which will then provide you with some security to ensure that that device has been taken off the network and can no longer be part of an ongoing security breach. When we're looking into ransomware, which I'm sure Alan's going to allude to a lot more around protection and backups, this is where we can obviously, the most recommended step. We like to say the philosophy, if it's not if it's going to happen, it's when. So having the ability to return to business as usual and ensure that if it does go wrong and that unfortunate event does happen, that you can return to business as usual as soon as possible and not have to pay any form of ransomware ransom. And then in terms of the last day, when we look back to exfiltration, what you really need to have in your net from a tooling perspective is some form of data loss prevention. And this can ensure that if at any point you are seeing large amounts of data, or even data that meets certain expressions, so data that meets credit card information, or something that might lose personal identifiable information, if something meets that criteria and is being exported out of your network anywhere, that you become alerted to that, and that you can do something about it once you become aware of it. And that's my side now. I'm going to pass over to you, Alan, if that's okay.
Yeah, I don't think I can take control here, Stephen. If you want to stop sharing, I'll pick up and share from my side. Just quickly check you can see that okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Perfect. Okay, so thanks for that, Stephen. So I think what we covered there was the initial piece on sort of detection of inception, and what we'll look at now is sort of Commvault side of it, and how we protect the data that's under management, because ultimately that's your fallback. Okay, so if we take the analogy of securing a house, and I think of your data assets as securing those assets and securing by default. First and foremost, have a plan. Have a plan to recover. Make sure that you're in a position to retrieve those assets that your business needs to operate. Kind of said at the top there, 50% of organisations don't think they're in a position to recover. We need to improve that stat and give people confidence that the data they're storing, that their business relies on, is recoverable in a secure and timely manner. Work out what's important to your business. So identify the data assets that are required, that are the most valuable to your organisation, and secure them by default. If you take the picture of the house here, if you've got doors on your house, I'm sure you lock them. If you've got windows with locks, you may lock them as well. You may have areas in your house that need to be more secure than others, so apply those areas. You may put your most sensitive information or data in a safe where only you know the passcode, the key to access that. You may have monitoring tools, so you may be tied into alarm systems that are linked up to third-party companies and/or police. And kind of lastly, in the bottom corner there, you may have anomaly detectors. In this instance, in a house, we're talking about a pet or a dog that identifies you that something's not quite right, that there's something suspicious happening, and you need to look into this a bit further. What we're saying here, what we're suggesting is there's no silver bullet here. You have to apply these different features in layers. Look at secure by default and zero trust. And obviously continuously monitor. This is a moving market. Things are changing fairly rapidly, so you have to keep on top of this and make sure that your data is safe and secured and fully recoverable. From our side, from Commvault side, we map onto the NIST framework. So that's looking at sort of reducing your cybersecurity exposure, identify, protect, monitor, respond, and recover. And the capabilities that we have in the platform. So again, we're looking at securing that backup infrastructure, because we know that if there is a ransomware attack, if there's a cyber attack, they're going after your data protection copies. They're trying to remove that fallback position, because ultimately that's what you need to get back to our normal state. So we've ensured that we have the correct processes and procedures in place in the background to make sure that data is accessible and recoverable. I should point out as well that the capabilities that we'll kind of walk through here are built into the platform. We think that if you rely on Commvault through a service, or whether you're running it internally, then these should be in by default. We're not suggesting that these are any additional add-ons. These are here by default. So leverage them, take advantage of them, improve your security posture by applying these capabilities. If you look at identify, so we'll have a secure access control. We'll limit who has access to the platform, and I'll touch on that a little bit in the next slide. Centralized management of the platform, so ensuring not just visibility across your data assets, but ensuring that you've got a single pane of glass to see who has access to that environment and how they're using that access. If you move on to the protect stage, then we have immutability, again, based and baked into the platform. We have a number of networking topologies to apply both physical and virtual air gaps that are there to help secure that data and isolate. It's obviously fully encrypted end to end. If you move around the circle to the monitoring, we have active monitoring that's obviously looking for suspicious activity, that's looking for threats into your environment. We apply some AI and some machine learning in the background there to make sure that we're sampling those data sets and limiting as much as we can false positives. You move on then to respond. Again, we have embedded processes that will can automate a lot of these processes. So as issues are identified, alerted, reported, we can take corrective actions in an automated fashion. And lastly, and probably most importantly, is being in a position to quickly recover. So I mean, that's in most ransomware attacks, they talk about up to a week before they had full access to their data. Now, think about your own organizations, your own business. Can you survive without those assets for a week? Well, some environments can, depending on your sector or your vertical, but a week's a long time in business. And again, from stats that we're aware of, there's something around the 20% of organizations hit by ransomware attacks never recovered. So you're talking about potentially putting your business at risk by not following the appropriate procedures. Not trying to scaremonger here. Hopefully you appreciate that it's realistically, it's a matter of when, not if. Ultimately, you're under some form of attack. So I think prepare for the worst and hope for the best. Looking at a zero trust model, obviously that's the foundation of how we secure data and how it's accessed. We have a AAA framework, so make sure that only the correct authorized people are accessing the platform. Make sure they have the limited capability that's required to carry out that function, no more, no less. And also make sure that it's accountable and we're following that process and how it's been accessed and any modifications and how those operations are happening. We also have embedded, and we support external MFA, multi-factor authentication, and we have embedded multi-factor authentication options. We know that, again, industry stats, around 50% of SMEs are using multi-factor authentication across their applications and platforms, which is a surprisingly low number, I think, under current circumstances, when it's a known and effective preventative procedure that can be used to protect accounts. Very little cost generally, and again, we have that capability baked into the platform. If you're not using it, it's something we can enable. We have a 4 eyes authorization process, again, which I'll touch on in the next slide. And we also support privileged access management from some external partners like CyberArk. Moving around the circle again, we secure the application. So we're following the SIST framework to make sure that those devices are hardened within the Commvault infrastructure that's managing your data, and it's a fully secured platform. On the networking side, as you would expect when you're working with service providers, it's a fully multi-tenanted platform. So we have data isolation, again, at our core. We can physically and virtually air gap that to help in that data separation and help secure that. We then move around to immutability. And again, both at the application layer, so within the Commvault platform itself, we can apply worm locks to ensure that if, in the unlikely event that somebody compromises your backup environment, they couldn't go in and say simply change a retention period, excuse me, and force an expiry of data. So if it's locked to a retention setting within the Commvault platform, that can't be adjusted. Even as a provider or as a direct customer, you couldn't change that yourself. You would have to contact Commvault as the vendor and ask us to change that, and that would have to go through an authorization process. So at the application level, immutability, also in the background, regardless of which hardware platform you're using, we can apply immutability to that with storage locks, or if you're using worm lock capability hardware, will also support that. Okay. Looking at the framework and identity again, we have a security dashboard again that will profile your security posture within the Commvault settings. So here we can, again, from a single page, we can monitor how the environment's operating, if you're applying the processes that are available to you through the product, and it will highlight any gaps. This is a lot of the processes that are highlighted here will have click-throughs. So if there's any areas that are potentially falling short, so if you're looking at MFA not enabled, if you're looking at login attempts not being set or exceeded, if you're not using multi-level authorization, they'll be highlighted here and flagged. And from this dashboard, you can have a simple click-through that will either enable that capability for you, or will show you the process on how to achieve that. Again, it's continually updated. So if things change within your environment, because again, we know if a malicious actor can access your applications, they'll start to turn things off. They'll start to remove alerts. They'll start to disable reporting. So you want to make sure that this is viewed on a regular basis. And I'm sure the guys at ANS are on top of this for you. But just to make you aware that these processes are followed in the background, and we have a dashboard that monitors that and helps us enable and keep that secure level. On the 4 eyes authorization workflows, again, this is baked into the product. And what we're looking to do here is limit your exposure to not just external attackers, but potentially internal malicious threats. Not always malicious threats, even it could be accidental. If somebody accesses your protection copies and decides to delete a backup copy, remove a client, change a schedule, these things can be tagged into a workflow process that will have to have multiple approvers. So simple approval process, and you'll get approve or deny. But that ensures that there are some capability within the platform that not a single actor can go in and make wholesale changes. So something that if you're not using, again, it's worth looking at, and again, can help from the threat from external, but also internal actors. Then look at the sort of monitor, respond and recover framework. We touched on the security dashboard there, and that will give you an overall health assessment of how the environment's operating, and give you a clear indication of where you sit and how secure those assets are that are being stored. We'll look at alerting. We integrate with a number of different platforms at the back end. So when it comes to alerting, we can make sure that anything that is identified as a potential threat or risk is sent to the correct engine to alert for forward actions. On the sanitization, obviously, once something's been identified, once it's been alerted, we can look at removing those threats. So that could be also triggered by a workflow where you'd look at isolating a device or a server, or it could be if it's individual files, applications, we can look to isolate them and remove from your backup copies so that you're not open to reinfection. On the orchestrated recovery, again, part of the whole process, we can recover into isolated environments. We can trigger effectively DR type recovery processes and operations to ensure that your environment is up and running as quickly as possible. We also have a cross recovery processes, which hopefully you're aware of, meaning that you could potentially recover from anywhere to anywhere, which give you some additional flexibility and capability when it's needed most. Coming round to how we monitor the environment. So we'll monitor both your live environment and your backup environment for anomalies. And this is important because we know that if a cyber threat, if a ransomware attacker gains a foothold in your environment, they can go unnoticed for a period of time. And during that time process, they're looking at lateral movement, they're looking at extending their reach, they're possibly looking at data exfiltration, copying data from your environment so that can be used as an additional threat against you. So I think monitoring your backup copies is good, but it's certainly not enough. So we will cover both live and backup. Looking at how we do that, we'll have honeypots that sit on workloads that are being protected, and they'll monitor, by default, they'll monitor every 4 hours for suspicious activity on those files. They're obviously honeypot files, so no one should be accessing them. There's no reason why there should be any activity on those. We also have file anomaly alerts that, again, are running on your production servers, and that data is sampled every 5 minutes. So we're looking for unusual activity on modify, delete, size. There's a few other processes that are monitored there for changes in that environment, anything that would be termed as suspicious. Part of that process in the background is where we're using machine learning to say that, well, actually we sample this and we'll update every 7 days to say, well, this is normal behavior. This is activity that we're expecting within this particular environment, so we can limit those false positives. We've extended this capability in our most recent update to look at file type anomalies. So we'll look at MIME headers here, and if it says it's a PDF, but it's actually got an executable extension or it's an application, we'll obviously flag that as being suspicious, and then send those off to the monitoring platforms. In the background as well, we're also looking at file anomalies. In the background, any changes in size, in processes, any suspect activity at the account level, so the multiple logon attempts against admin level accounts or any level account, anything that seems suspicious and would warrant further investigation. Again, with that, we'll look at rapid restore. How do we get you back to a normal state in the event of a threat or an attack? Again, we'll take these anomalies and insights that have been triggered. You can view them, you can look at forensics, you can send them to isolated environments. You can obviously pass them back to, I'm sure, ANS, and they'll look at these data assets for you and help you assess how much of a threat that actually is. We have added a new capability recently that we're bringing to market, that's cyber threat deception capability. That will be offered as a SaaS type offering, and what that will do is sit in your environment and act as though it's a network device or a server or a print server, and that will sit and wait for, again, suspicious activity. On the identification of that suspicious activity, we'll then look to isolate that and then use forensic process to identify where that threat came from. So we'll assess whether that's an internal threat, an external threat, whether it's a VPN attack, whether it's RDP processes. So once it's identified, then we can obviously isolate and then remove that from your network. Kind of lastly, on the recovery piece, we have subject code delete capabilities. So what we're looking at here is allowing you to, when identified where the threat lives, it could be a file type, it could be an application that's been identified, we can go through those backup copies and subjectly remove that to ensure that you're not open to reinfection in the event that somebody triggers a restore further down the line. So we can remove these from the copies. Also means that with this type of subject code delete, you can ensure that the majority of that backup is still useful and is probably required as part of your recovery process. So there's no need to destroy multiple copies or multiple assets in the background if you can just subjectly take out those individual files. Kind of putting this together and mapping it to the framework. So under identification, we've got the dashboard. We have the settings that can be configured around MFA. We have single sign-on. You can look at limiting login attempts. We have the 4 eyes workflows that, again, will restrict how the platform's accessed at any particular operations that could impact your recovery. We looked at protecting through effective reporting and alerting. So again, we will monitor both your live environment that have Commvault technology installed, and also the backup. We have to make sure that's secured from end to end, and the integration with the reporting and alerting engines that make sure that as these incidents appear, the correct people are notified, and potentially we can trigger automatic actions off the back. Immutability. Again, you have to make sure these assets are secured because in the event of attack, you're going to need these to recover and be in a position to recover these quickly. So we have bottom locks at the application level and also at storage levels, whether that's running in an ANS data center, whether you're running it on-prem or you're looking at public cloud, we can secure those assets and make those copies immutable. We also support those air-gapped topologies, so either physically air-gapped or virtually air-gapped can be configured through the settings. And lastly, kind of with these in place, make sure that you're in the position to recover and make sure you have the confidence that you can recover quickly and get your operations back to normal state. Kind of lastly here, we kind of started off with the analogy of a house and how you secure a house. I think with the processes and procedures that can be put in place, both from the excuse me, the initial monitoring and identification that ANS can provide, through to the secure data sets that Commvault has inherent within the product, we can change that house into a fortress. What we're looking to do to follow that kind of guidance here is assess your threats, understand the data assets that you have and mitigate those risks. Follow the guidance in locking down the environment, both from the hardware point of view, from services and processes. Continuously monitor. It's a fast-changing market. New threats will appear as time goes by, so continually monitor, look for those threats where you can, and make sure that you analyze those threats and take corrective actions. And lastly, and with the Commvault platform, we fully believe that you'll be in a better place to recover that data quickly. Kind of lastly for me, one of the opening slides says there was a ransomware attack every 11 seconds last year. The numbers show that this year, the number of attacks is nearly double in the first 3 months that it was for the whole of last year. So again, not trying to be doom and gloom. It's a fact of life now. It's a growing market. There's threats across all industries and sectors. There's a number of things we can do to reduce that risk and make sure that you're in a position to respond and recover. And we've set these out across the slides there. Anything to add on that, Stephen?
No, that was really insightful. Thank you, Alan. I forgot to mention at the beginning that if anyone has any questions on what Alan has gone through, or if anyone has been through a ransomware attack and had to, try and restore to business as usual, be really interested to hear. Doesn't sound like it. It's okay. Okay. Well, I'll thank you for joining our webinar today, and please reach out to us at ANS if you would like some more details on what's been discussed here today. Thank you.
Thanks all.